Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shannon McLean. I've been a project editor here at OffSec for just over a year, and I'm really excited to chat with you today and invite my colleagues, Jeremy and Johnny, to talk about OffSec's unique approach to teaching hacking skills and kind of how we learn on this subject. So we'll start off with Jeremy. I think you're in a really interesting position to talk about this since, for a number of reasons, given your experience with OffSec. Can you kind of introduce us to your journey into this field and how you came to OffSec?
Hey, sure, Shannon. Thanks. So my name is Jeremy. I've been with OffSec now for about just over five years. I started my journey with OffSec really as a student, and I previously to going into security, I started my journey into information security really with OffSec. It was really my first foray into InfoSec, and I spent about 6 months in the PWK labs learning on my own and with OffSec material, going through the labs, trying to understand what this field is, and eventually passing the exam. Quickly upon passing the exam, I was really lucky because there was a job opening at the time for the student admin position. And the student admins are those who help students with their day-to-day journey through PWK and other OffSec courses. And I was really lucky to be hired from that job opening. So I spent about 3 years as a student administrator and then pivoted into project management, where I helped get out the recent courses that OffSec has pushed out, Windows user mode exploitation, the PWK update of last year, some others as well. And most recently, I've pivoted into a product management role where I'm helping to communicate what we're doing both internally and externally. Shannon, you're muted, I believe.
Thanks. I think that's a really wide range of experience of being able to kind of see OffSec from the outside and inside. So that's really valuable and interesting. Johnny, could you kind of introduce your experience as project editor and kind of how you came into this role?
Yeah, very different journey from Jeremy. Many years ago, I did a master's program in teaching and education. And then after that, I spent about 15 years doing instructional design, which just means I was teaching and creating and curating different types of training and education products for all kinds of different companies. And I actually, quite a while ago, started doing freelance work for OffSec, and loved the people here and always knew this was a place that I wanted to end up. So finally, I just said, hey, I want to come work for you guys. You need to hire me full time. And thankfully they did. So that was about 4 years ago. I've worked on, I think I've touched just about all of the courses now in some way. So I've been deeply involved in the course creation process since joining.
Wonderful. Yeah, it sounds like you both bring some really valuable perspectives to, how we teach cybersecurity as well as how we kind of learn those skills and internalize them. So I want to invite folks to leave questions in the Q&A, leave questions in the chat. We'll try to address those at the end as much as we can, leave time for that. But I want to dive in a little bit and talk about, how we learn and what it is we're trying to learn. So I'll start off with you, Jeremy. Since you've had the experience of taking all the OffSec courses and earning certifications, being on the other side of things as a student admin through that learning process, how would you say that OffSec approaches teaching students hacking skills that they can take into the real world, into the real situation?
So one of the first things to say here is that hacking is a bit of a strange discipline compared to other things that you could learn because it has a very, very, very wide or long feedback loop. So what does that mean? Let's say that you were going to go learn a musical instrument. And learning a musical instrument has a really quick feedback loop because if you make a mistake, you hear that mistake immediately. And a good music teacher will help you understand like, oh, that was the wrong note. You should play a different note. Likewise, if you make a mistake on time, you can sort of feel that intuitively. With hacking, it is the opposite of that because if you have a machine and the machine has 7 possible attack vectors and only one of them is vulnerable, if you go off and attack one of the non-vulnerable attack vectors, there's no feedback loop to tell you that you're wrong. There's no way to know that what you're doing at that moment isn't going to pan out. So a lot of what we're learning isn't necessarily the technical skills of how do I hack this particular service, but more how am I thinking about this machine as I'm going through it so that I don't get stuck in one of these long paths that isn't going to yield any fruit. It isn't really, so on one hand, we're trying to teach information. So we're trying to teach like, what does hacking SSH mean? What does it mean to attack web applications? But on the other hand, there's this whole concept of mindset and thinking and how we're going about the process to get to where we need to go. And so OffSec really tries to teach the former by teaching the latter.
Yeah. Johnny, how would you say that applies to what you've learned about teaching and how to bring students in into like a non-traditional subject such as hacking?
Yeah, I love listening to Jeremy's answers. I think mine are going to be different. My answers are going to be different, probably maybe a little more like abstract and academic, because that's a little more my background. But that should be an interesting contrast. So I want to start with education theory being a very young field. So we've only been trying to understand how people learn and how to teach people for about 100 years or so. So ask me these questions again next year, I might have totally different answers. But having said that, I think what's unique about a course like this or a field of study like this is that we have to prepare students for situations that we know for certain that we cannot show them. Mm-hmm. So we can't possibly teach every network architecture or security posture or vulnerability. And we're even trying to prepare students to analyze and find vulnerabilities in software that has not been written yet. That makes this a really unique sort of set of problems to solve. So most of the education we experience in our life relies on what's called a banking model. So a teacher will deposit information into a student's head, and then the same way that you deposit money into a bank. And then at the end of the class, you check the account balance and you see if what you deposited earlier is still there. So in biology class, they tell you what a mitochondria is, in week 4, and then in the final exam, they say, what is the mitochondria? So we can't use that model here. So OffSec definitely has a specific set of skills, best practices, procedures, and things like that we need to hand off. But we know that our students need more than that. So we can't use that traditional model. We need students to be able to adapt and combine and grow these techniques far beyond the exact series of steps that we've shown them. So if we really believe in that higher goal for our courses, we have to intentionally build them in a way that delivers more than a set of information, and we have to make our exams do more than simply ask the student to just give us back the information that we gave them.
Yeah, it sounds like this is really atypical to traditional styles of teaching.
Yeah.
Do you think there are other education models that we could borrow from or learn something from?
Maybe. There are a few things. So before I started in OffSec and information security, I was a martial arts teacher for some time, and so that's one domain where there's actually a pretty wide array of people in InfoSec and at OffSec who have some sort of martial arts or combat training, and so I think there's something there where you have to. It's a domain where you are unprepared for what's going to happen. You have to understand that an attacker can come at you, and you need to be able to defend that without knowing exactly what they're going to do. So you need to be prepared for this uncertainty. Likewise, I would assume I'm not a military veteran, but I would assume that a lot of the training in military type training has to have similar kind of training where you need to prepare soldiers for something that they don't know that they're going to expect. And all three of these domains have this concept of attacking and defending, and that's not a coincidence either. There's something about having an intelligent adversary that you're fighting against that makes it so that you need this sort of dynamic learning skill. One of my colleagues actually earlier today, I didn't think about this earlier, but he was talking about how in some sense it's kind of similar to art, because if you have a really good artist trying to teach you, they can teach you, the technique of how to paint, but to actually come up with that creativity on your own, that's not something that's easy to teach in that way.
Yeah, that's another good comparison, I think. How do you think that compares to more traditional methods, Johnny, like our universities and colleges and things like that?
Yeah, it's very obvious that a lot of early education is going to be information in, information out. That's just by necessity. That was always really frustrating for me. And I remember thinking, and I know there's a lot of thought out there, that once you get into a college or university, that's where real learning and real exploration happens. And that's where you learn critical thinking. That's not always the case. In fact, there was a study done about a decade ago, and the book was called Academically Adrift, and they were specifically looking at this problem of whether or not universities are teaching critical thinking. And they measured students, thousands of students over several years, and about 45% of them showed zero improvement in terms of critical thinking, complex reasoning, or even writing. And that sort of failure to me is not the student's fault. That means that 45% of those kids were they're 19, 20, were in classrooms where the teacher was just focused on handing information over. If they had one teacher in one class, it could have made a difference. So I think the moral of the story is that we just can't be complacent. Our natural gravity is going to be to repeat that same banking information in, information out model. We can't just collect information and fill out a syllabus. If we do that, we know for certain that the student comes out the other side with information that may or may not stick around, and no improvement in terms of critical thinking skills. So to answer your question directly, no, I wouldn't necessarily borrow from universities or colleges.
Yeah, I think that sounds really limiting in terms of cybersecurity and hacking skills. As we've talked about, some of these things haven't even been written yet. Some of the things that you may be trying to break into may not exist yet. So you really need to develop the critical thinking skills. So how would you say, in your experience, the OffSec is trying to teach not just the specific techniques, but the critical thinking skills behind them?
Yeah, so critical thinking is kind of a magic phrase in academia. In part, a lot of American academia in particular is geared towards a job market. A lot of American employers will require a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, specifically because they think that those people who come out of a 4-year degree will have those critical thinking skills. And this is not just information security, it's any job. So there's a lot of debate and research and exploration to try to figure out what we mean when we say critical thinking. So without getting into it too much, let's say that it is applying a logical framework to a new set of information. And it may be more of an art than a science. And we're using structured thinking. We're applying logic structures. We're assessing our own reasons for belief. We're testing and assessing and hypothesizing and so on. So one of the things that we do know helps is what's called deliberate practice, and that's a specific term. And in our case, the deliberate practice needs to focus on critical thinking. So athletes do deliberate practice if they need to focus on free throws. They don't go to the gym and play a full game of basketball. They go stand at the free throw line and shoot free throws over and over and over to get better at that, and analyze what they're doing, count how many times they made the shot versus didn't, and try different techniques and things. So that's the sort of deliberate practice that we're talking about. And the trick for us is to figure out, what does deliberate practice for critical thinking look like, specifically in the context of cybersecurity. So to some degree, Shannon, I'll throw it back to you, right? That's really where and how you and I get deeply involved in the course creation process, working alongside the content developers.
Yeah, definitely. I think I agree with what you say. I've noticed a lot about what you're describing in my work as project editor here, trying to make sure that, we're exposing the why, in addition to focusing on the language and accessibility and making sure that the content's, easily digestible for our students. And it's not just an information dump, as you mentioned. So we've been talking kind of in general about the courses. Jeremy, maybe you can speak a bit to how, what the unique challenges are that our OffSec students are facing.
Sure. So the first thing to say is really that the goal of any of OffSec's courses is to prepare a student for a professional world. So we want our labs to be as close as possible to an actual real life experience, with some exceptions, but that is the main hallmark of what we're trying to do. With one exception, and that is that most of our lab machines currently for our courses are vulnerable in some way. So we don't want students sitting around trying to attack a completely invulnerable machine, or at least one that's designed to be invulnerable. But most of the machines that we have in the labs will be vulnerable in some way. The exam, or the oscp exam, or any of our exams really, aren't meant to, as Johnny said before, they are not meant to be something that you just take the teacher's answer and put it in a pretty package and give it to OffSec as your solution. It's supposed to demonstrate your ability to think through these problems and to solve them, given that you haven't encountered them before. And that's why there's such a large array of machines in our exams and in our labs. Johnny, you earlier talked about how one of the challenges that we face and that we try to teach here is how to kind of self-reflect and think about our own process. One of the ways that this manifests itself is in something that we like to call like the rabbit hole problem. So to use my example from earlier, we have this machine, there are 7 attack vectors. One of them is the correct attack vector, or at least one of them will be vulnerable. We have 2 options. Maybe we attack the right attack vector. And if we do that, then what is our error mode? What is our failure mode? Where can we get stuck? Well, let's say that the attack vector requires that we spend an hour going through, and after the hour, we're going to find the thing that we need to find. But if we stop at minute 59 and we never get to that 60th minute, then we're going to back out from the correct answer and now get stuck in looking at these other 6. So that's a bad thing. The other way is the opposite. We can get stuck on one of these 6 false vectors where we, try to dig in and we think that we're close and we think that we're close, but there's nothing there. And so those two, trying to think through those 2 possibilities and live in the moment, think to yourself, which situation am I in right now? What's more likely? That's something that's really difficult to teach, but it's something that students do need to learn.
Gotcha. Yeah. That does sound challenging. It sounds like some of that can be influenced by the student. Johnny, do you have any input based on what you know about learning, about how students can sort of use what they know about their learning?
Yeah, this is not, it's sometimes if you call it a course, you can kind of lump it in with your experience with other courses. And I think in many ways, this is so different. It may be helpful to categorize it differently. The most obvious thing about this classroom, if we want to call it that, is that there's no teacher. There's no person standing in front of you. So that sense of momentum that is created when a teacher is just walking around the room, being physically present with an expectation that you do the work is gone now. So if I enroll in this course and set aside 3 hours a day to work on a module, but I spend that time watching Netflix instead, there are zero consequences for that. There's no teacher there to scold me for that. So that sense of momentum or motivation is gone. The sense of camaraderie is also not as immediately natural. I can't look 3 or 4 feet to my left and see someone else who is struggling with the same problem I'm struggling with and gain, frankly, some encouragement from that, right? So, of course, there are the student forums. You could try to take the course the same time as a friend. And even if someone's very introverted, it can be comforting to know that other people are also working, through these things. And finally, I think self-knowledge can be super helpful with a course like this, on knowing things about ourselves as we approach the learning. Do I learn better by reading, by seeing, by doing? When should I ask for help in the forums or from a student admin? And what sort of help do I want? What's the best kind of help for me? Do I need to go back a few pages and review things, or do I need to rewind a video, and so on? So knowing some of those answers for yourself can be really helpful as you approach the material.
Definitely. I think that's an important thing to consider when you're engaging with it. You mentioned the student admins, and I think that's an interesting role that is something you might not see in other learning environments like YouTube or whatever it might be. So Jeremy, since you were a student admin previously, can you talk a little bit about that role and, from a student perspective and then from the student admin perspective, what an exchange might look like?
Yeah, of course. So the first thing there is that the role has really evolved a lot since I joined OffSec. When I joined, OffSec was really small, and so the student admins wore plenty of different hats. Now it is gravitating more and more towards a mentorship role, and so that I think is what your question is asking about. So in that respect, a student admin tries to play the role of a teacher, but a little bit of a Socratic teacher. So a student will come and ask a question, and the goal of the student admin isn't to answer the question. It's not to say try harder. That's not something that the student admins ever say. We did like a decade ago, but no longer. Instead of saying try harder, the idea is to get the student to think to themselves, oh, I need to try harder here. How does that happen? So let's say a student says, hey, there's this machine. I don't know how to hack it. Okay. The student admin will say, well, what have you tried so far? Try to establish a dialogue, to understand the student and the student's perspective, but also to get the student to think about these things. Maybe the student at that point will say, you know what? I didn't try very much at all. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to leave and I'm going to try and come back. And in an hour, I'll come back and see where I am. If that happens, then that's great. If not, the student might say, hey, well, I've tried Nmap, and Nmap didn't return any results in my scan. Okay, what kind of results did you get? What kind of flags did you use to send your scan? Did you check TCP and UDP, or did you just check TCP? Oh, I only checked TCP. Maybe I should go back and check UDP. And so this conversation ideally will continue until the student realizes, aha, there's something that I didn't think about before that I can do now. And then they'll go off and they'll go try to do that thing, and hopefully that'll spurn their creative juices and get them flowing in the right direction.
Yeah, I think if I can jump on there real
Yeah,
quick,
yeah.
Please.
I think student admins are really there to help the student do that deliberate practice on critical thinking. So to borrow from Jeremy's example, the student admin in that conversation is saying things and ideally mimicking a sort of thought process that will eventually happen in the student's own head, right? Eventually, the student reaches a point where he or she is sort of asking themselves those questions. So you can think of it this way. There is a correct solution, and the student admin knows what that answer is. But this is also the exact moment where the real learning needs to happen. This is that deliberate practicing and critical thinking. So rather than just hand over the answer, which will benefit, what will actually benefit the student the most in this situation is to help them learn that thinking process. So you do that by asking things like, what have you tried? What assumptions did you make? What else do you know so far? Is there some specific piece of information that you need to be able to move forward? Where can you find that information? So if I'm a student and I feel like my goal is to just get the reverse shell, that sort of guidance is really frustrating because there's a shorter path to that reverse shell and it's you giving me the exact answer, right? So perhaps counterintuitively, the real goal is not the reverse shell. That is frosting on the cake. The actual goal is to understand how to encounter that moment of frustration and find a way out of it.
Yeah, yeah. I think I saw somebody else mention frustration in the chat as well. And a lot of what both of you have mentioned reminds me of kind of like the old school rubber ducky method, where you talk to the rubber ducky next to you about what you tried to do and try to think through what you haven't thought through yet. And that can be really frustrating. We tend to think of that in a negative light. Do you think it's important for our students to get frustrated?
Well, frustration has a lot of really negative connotations and feelings for us, especially in Western culture. We don't like it. So there was, I don't even want to call it a study. It was a very anecdotal sort of observation that was made, comparing American students to high school students to Japanese high school students. They gave both groups an impossible math equation and an hour to try to figure it out. So there's no solution. It's a bottomless rabbit hole. The Japanese students tried for over an hour, and the American students on average gave up before 30 seconds was up, and then just said, oh, we haven't had this yet. So don't draw any conclusions from that. There's two classrooms, but it does suggest there's something going on culturally that an American student will have to unlearn some things. Frustration and struggle do not have to be bad, especially if we can remove the negative emotion from the situation. These courses are about handing over a set of knowledge, but we have to keep coming back to the real goal, right? To some degree, this is what makes these courses unique, that we're trying to give someone the skills that they will need beyond the classroom to have a successful career in information security. So by definition, that means the student is encountering frustration and unknown threats.
Yeah, that does seem to reflect reality, but I do want to push on it a little bit. You know, what's this resistance to just giving students what they need, you know, as a student admin, for example, just to move forward? You know, if they've hit a point of frustration, and it seems like we're asking them to just go deeper into that frustration. So I just want to explore that a little bit more with both of you.
Yeah, I'll jump in first, and I think it's not so much. Somebody in the chat said this too. It's not just in this course, but it's in life, right? Frustration is just inevitable in life, not just in this field. Let me tell you. So I'll bring up another study here because I think this is really interesting, and I love this stuff. So psychologists gave a bunch of people a very, very simple task: that find the letter that's in the middle of a sequence of letters. So, for example, A, B, A. B is the middle letter, very simple and very repetitive. So people are doing this exercise, and while they do it, they have one of these caps on that measures brain activity, and they were really specifically interested in what happens when somebody slips up and they choose wrong. Everyone in the study gets an immediate negative reaction less than a quarter of a second after getting a big red X or whatever on the screen. Does not feel good to get something wrong. What's interesting is that one of those groups had an additional brain reaction after that. There was the second and bigger signal that was that person reminding themselves, like, oh, I made a mistake. I need to pay more attention. And the difference in those two groups is that if you had a positive reaction in a moment of frustration, you were more likely to agree with statements like, when the going gets tough, I put in more effort, or if I make a mistake, I will learn and try to figure it out. What we're really interested in those moments of frustration, because that's where learning happens. If you have that, oops, I need to pay more attention reaction, you improve, right? You're less likely to choose the wrong answers over and over again. And you feel better too. Remember, we talked about the teacher's not there, that sense of push and momentum and motivation isn't there. So that needs to be internal. And if you just feel better, you're going to be more motivated to stick with the material. So that learning really only happens if you have the right mindset.
Yeah, so let me build on that a little bit from the PWK Labs point of view. If I gave you the solutions to every lab machine, you'd be shocked at how little lines of code you would need to write for each one, or the command that you would need to write to get remote code execution. It's just a few lines of code. But it takes hours and hours of research to figure out these machines and to understand that. So the problem here, as with all machines, is a problem of uncertainty. You don't know the machine. If you knew everything there was to know about it, hacking it would be as easy as memorizing whatever MSF console command you need to put in. So this idea of, okay, I don't know what this machine is, but I'm going to learn about it. My goal isn't to hack the machine. It's to build a model of the machine in my head that's as accurate as possible. And the more accurate I make that model, the more closely aligned that model is with actual reality, the better my chances of hacking the machine. And if I can get to 100% and the machine is actually hackable, then I've hacked it. So it's this information gathering. We talk about information gathering like it's the first step of hacking, but it's really the whole thing. Because if you can do that, then you've done 98% of the work. I'm going to go off tangent for a second here. I was playing a RTS, a real-time strategy game, the other day with a friend of mine. And I didn't realize that there was a link here, but let me go on this tangent. So we were playing a 2 versus 2 game. This is kind of a military game where you build a base and build an army and try to fight the opponent. And we got attacked really early on in the game. And my friend was frustrated by that because he said, why can the opponent do something that's so easy to execute and so hard to defend against? And my response was, I like when the opponent does something like that because I know that there has to be some solution. And so if I can, or if we as a team can solve that and understand how to beat this particular strategy, then that'll never beat us again in the future. And so in a similar sense, not the same sense, but in a similar sense, hacking is the same. Everything is mostly deterministic. You're up against a machine that has exact specific specifications. And so if you understand what those are, then the next time that you encounter something similar, you will be able to either defeat it, or you'll be able to say, hey, wait, what I did the last time didn't work, but the machine is very similar, so therefore there must be something different. So even in failure, you are learning something. And having the mentality that failing is good because failing means learning, that is the key to the try harder mindset.
Yeah, we've talked about the try harder mindset a little bit here, and I've heard a lot about it since I started working at OffSec for sure. It's very connected to the culture. Can you kind of explain a little bit more in depth what that means?
Sure. So like I said before, we don't actually say it anymore. Even before I was a student, it was something that was said. But at that time, again, OffSec was really small, and the student base were really seasoned pen testers already coming into it in the first place. Now it is more of a backdrop to everything that we're doing, because we want students to absorb this mindset. We also don't want to straight up say it. So that's sort of the challenge, and that's the problem that the essays that the student admins solve through their discourse and through their mentorship with students. It's a short motto, right? You can say it, you can remember it. Everybody who's heard of OffSec knows that try harder, there's a dragon, try harder, right? So we did write a blog post to describe what this means to us. And so if we break it down, there are aspects of creativity, persistence, being perceptive. So we don't think, at least we don't hope, that it's an elitist attitude. It often gets portrayed that way. That's not what we mean by it. For us, it doesn't really imply that everything that you've done to get to where you are isn't valid. It's more to acknowledge the fact that this enterprise of hacking requires you to go beyond wherever you're currently at. So the machine that you're attacking doesn't care, right? Like it's just there, and it's either vulnerable or it's not. And if it is, it's up to you to find it out. And there's no shortcut.
Yeah, that's true. And it sounds like it's really tied to that feeling of frustration we talked about earlier, and separating that from the, not the mistake, but the failure, or, whatever didn't work out. Johnny, do you have any input on kind of try harder and what you've learned about it in your years here?
Yeah, I actually think a lot about this, and I'm a curious person. So I'm really interested in why some people kind of bristle at it, because I don't think it's ever intended in a cruel way. It's certainly sort of funny. But I think that if I encounter that message when I'm in a negative place emotionally, I'm going to assume the worst. So let's say I'm teaching my kid how to ride a bike. He's just starting. He falls over and he hurts himself. If I run over there and say, try harder, he will probably quit bikes forever. So I need to make sure he's okay. I acknowledge that he did try, failure isn't fun. And then maybe I can say, try harder after all of that. So I can't speak for everyone who ever uses this phrase, but it should not mean everything I've tried up until now has been weak and ineffective. And it also does not mean I did not try very hard last time. And so I think I keep kind of coming back to this idea, but I think that in my mind, this phrase is really about having a healthy relationship with a moment of frustration and a healthy understanding of how to react and what to do when things aren't going super smoothly.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about difficulty and resilience and struggle. And it's interesting because when I think about, of course, like PWK, for example, I think about the pen testers I know in real life, they actually tend to be really determined and optimistic people. And I've actually joked that I think hackers are like the eternal optimists, which is, I mean, that to be a successful hacker, you have to really stick with a couple of ideas. And the first one is, I can figure out what I need. And the second one is, I can find a way to get it. So, even if you don't know a whole lot about the environment or everything, you'll find a pathway there, you'll find a foothold. And it's really about maintaining that perseverance. Does that feel like an accurate description?
Yeah, I love how you talk about the eternal optimist, as if the optimism never runs out. Definitely, I could say that, there are times where I'm hacking a machine and man, I don't know what to do next, and I really want to bang my head against the wall. But there is something to be said about trying to put your mindset in the position of I can do this, no matter what it is, I can do this. It's kind of like adopting this placebo in your head that even if it may not be true, adopting it for a moment is useful. So, for example, one of the ways I sometimes do this is I say to myself, I have infinite willpower. I definitely don't. But if I believe it, even for just a little bit longer, maybe I'll resist that extra slice of pizza, or I'll go on my run, or I'll make sure to study for the day. So it's not to say that I believe that I have infinite willpower or that I believe that I can literally hack every machine on the planet, but by just putting that in my mind for a little bit, that can help a lot.
Definitely. Johnny, do you think that's a mentality we can teach?
At the risk of being immediately told to try harder, I would say that that's certainly something that we can try to do. It is worth acknowledging, though, that you can't hand off optimism and you can't hand off a mindset. A teacher can't do those things. The best that we can do is create a classroom where a student can cultivate those things for themselves. But optimism and thinking positively are going to be hugely valuable for students. I will also say everybody is an optimist on the day that they win the lottery, but you can't learn it when you're having a really easy time. You need to be in a situation where it doesn't come naturally to you.
Definitely. It sounds like, not just optimism, but persistence is key here. So kind of landing on a few key takeaways. I'll start with you, Jeremy. Do you have any advice that you'd like to give to incoming students, students who are currently in an offset course?
Yeah, so one of the things that I harp on is think about what you're thinking about when you're going through a machine, when you're going through a problem or an exercise. Try to catch yourself in the middle of it and make sure that your thinking pattern is healthy and that it makes sense for the situation that you're in. The second thing is that when you're talking with an SA, when you're talking with a student admin, or even just another student, remember that, well, maybe a student doesn't, but the student admins definitely know the answers to the machines. They've done their oscp, they've worked on all these machines as students and later as OffSec employees. Some of them have built the machines, so they know them. The questions that they ask you might seem irrelevant. You might be like, why are they asking me this stupid question? I don't care about that. But they're actually going somewhere with that conversation. So try to humor them, and it'll pay dividends. And then lastly, I would say that this concept of failure is just a word, but in security, failure is inevitable. And what I mean by that is that if I attack a machine and I am successful, by definition, that means that the machine's security failed in some manner. And if I attack the machine and I'm unsuccessful, then that means that the security for that moment succeeded. So there's sort of this conservation of failure or conservation of success. So if we stop thinking of ourselves as just red teamers or just pen testers, and we're thinking of security as more of this global thing, then we can look at a situation where we fail and see that as, hey, wait, if we were the defender in this situation, we would have succeeded. And so we want to try to build both of these sides up so that we can play both the attacker and the defender at a given point in time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that does. I understand that logically. You know how you kind of have to maintain both mindsets there as you're going through and learning things that are valuable on either side. Johnny, do you have any input for new students?
Yeah, I want to recommend really specific things, and I've actually used both of these in different situations. I think they're quite helpful. So, as one of the best ways that you can do that deliberate practice in critical thinking is to try and predict outcomes as much as possible. So that could be a very small thing, like read a command line and predict what you think the output will look like. It could be something like at a larger level, like we're doing web application attacks. We just looked at URLs, then we looked at web page content. Take a moment to predict where you might want to look next, and then compare that with the direction that the course content goes. You will develop this ability to start evaluating your own growth in critical thinking. So that's the first thing. Try to predict as much as possible. The second thing is really cheesy, but I like it. Get a small Post-it. Choose a phrase for yourself, like a mantra or a kind of a small thing. It doesn't have to be try harder. It could be something as simple as like, you got this, or yes, you can, let's go, whatever. Put it on a Post-it and put it somewhere where you can see it, where it's in your, in your field of vision when you sit down at your computer. You cannot underestimate the simple power of thinking of yourself as capable. Right? There's that saying, one person says they can't, and another one says they can, and they are both usually correct. So it's just super important to kind of keep that motivation and it literally in front of yourself.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed in this field, especially, it's important to develop that persistence. That sometimes things aren't going to work, but maybe you learn something from it, and you need to keep going. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think having that self motivation in front of you is a really great idea. All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm just going to go ahead and move forward into a few of the questions that we've got from the audience. Start off. Jeremy, for someone who's a beginner in the field of penetration testing, how would you suggest that they go about learning different aspects of pen testing, what to start working on to sort of build the skills necessary for real world penetration tests?
Yeah, so if you're taking PWK, then I would suggest going through the syllabus and really taking your time with the course material. There's a tendency to want to rush into the labs because time is running out and you feel like if I'm not working on the labs, I'm not gaining value. But really being able to absorb that very, very thick book and be able to recall that information is really helpful when you go on to attack machines. As I said earlier, I would really pay attention to information gathering and think of any other topic as an exercise in information gathering. So if you're learning about how to write an exploit or how to modify a public exploit, think about it in terms of what information do I need to research or Google in order to make progress in this problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know there's a saying out there about, if you're going to chop down a tree, how much time you spend grinding the axe. So yeah, it's important. It's definitely important to spend time with the material. All right, my next question's for Johnny. How would you encourage autodidact or like self-led learning techniques and tendencies as someone who helps develop the modules?
It's kind of a funny question because I love this question. So an autodidact is a self-learner. So it's somebody who's able to learn without direct instruction. So it's really hard to teach someone how to teach themselves, because when you start teaching them, you're teaching them to learn from someone. So it gets messy. But we talked about resilience. I think I want to add to that a little bit and say one of the best things that we can do to encourage that sort of autodidacticism, I think that's a word, is by encouraging curiosity. Because a curious person is someone who's willing to go and keep searching and cultivate their own learning. So when we're building courses, we think of it this way. I've got somebody who's curious about volcanoes. I can either hand them some beautifully written paragraphs about volcanoes, or I could, this may be dangerous, but take them up to Mauna Loa in Hawaii, peek over the edge, like see the lava bubbling around in there. And I think one of those people is going to be pretty fired up because I've rewarded their curiosity. So that's when we're creating modules, we're always thinking about that real world context. Show the student what this looks like in the real world. Let them try things out, because those sorts of activities and exercises reward that sense of curiosity that the student needs to develop and grow. Good question.
Definitely. I think that your example with the volcano, that kind of hands-on, there's something about that, right? That you take with you, it's almost like it's encoded in your brain a different way. It's an experience instead of something that you read on a piece of paper. So I think that is really important when it comes to cybersecurity training, really practicing the skills. All right, let's see, going through some of the live questions we've received. Johnny, would you be able to share your thoughts on situated learning theory and kind of how that ties into building a community around OffSec?
Good question. Is this a test? Let's see if I remember. So situated learning theory is couples. There's a couple of different ideas. Number one is how the course is created, and I think we've covered that. We've talked about that. Number two is what I just talked about, which is the real world context. Like, you're not learning these things in an abstract. You're looking at a machine that is in the labs, or even in the course, that's as close to a representation of the real thing as possible. And number three is that social aspect of taking a course, and that is something that we hope is each student will do for themselves. It is hugely beneficial if you jump in the forums and or take the course with other people, participate in the community, and that is more than just you're sharing grievances about your frustration in a certain module. It really helps you develop and internalize these skills. Good question.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the communities are, like you said, not just a great place for interacting with folks who are dealing with similar frustrations, but also for learning those skills in a communal way. The next question I'm going to throw, it's probably going to be our last one. I'm going to toss it to you, Jeremy. Given your experience, could you provide kind of like a beginner learning path for somebody who wants to learn hacking? Like, where should they start?
Yeah, so I would say that the most important three things to get at least a little bit of experience in is number one, system administration. And if you're not familiar with Linux, that would definitely be the way to go. If you are, then maybe take on Windows. Then get a better basic understanding of networking, understand how subnets work and how machines can communicate to each other, both in theory and in practice. And then a little bit of scripting. There's an age-old question: do you need to be a programmer to be a pen tester? OffSec's opinion, not necessarily. It's definitely helpful, but being able to read code, and particularly being able to be like, hey, I don't understand the syntax. Can I go Google it? Can I use Stack Overflow to figure it out? That skill of doing that, that's really important too.
Gotcha. Yeah, it sounds like a kind of a bit of a wide variety, but also just being able to be adaptable and to learn new things as as languages get built out and as different technologies
I
are
would
developed.
Yes, I would add to that and also say that there's a more abstract skill here or abstract thing to learn, and that's to try to not view the computer as like this mysterious thing, right? Like to start to be like, okay, somebody built this and they probably built it with some mistakes and they probably used some flawless or flawed logic to do so, and to realize like a machine isn't this like angel or god, right? It's just a device.
Right, they're also built by people just like us. That's a great point to make. And also I think helps with that kind of persistence that we talked about earlier, and kind of helps you remember that there's got to be some flaw or foothold somewhere in here. So I think that's a good thing to hold on to. That just about wraps up our time. Lindsay put a link in the chat for Discord. I know we weren't able to get to all the questions. There were a lot that came in, but please join us on Discord. We'll have the conversation continue there in our offset community, chat with our employees, and also folks who are fellow students and learning the material. So thank you so much for showing up today. I'm really glad we were able to have this conversation. Johnny, Jeremy, thank you for all of your expertise. It's great to be able to kind of hear your experiences going through all the material and different perspectives in learning.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, everyone.